And they've been caught plundering investor income. So you had an element of the investor class devouring its own investor class. It's kind of fascinating dynamic to watch. And billions of dollars involved here. And some of these people, they've been caught. Some of these people have been caught, and they're going to have to do hours of community service. There's a whole country that got victimized this way, where the state literally failed in that second function of protecting the capitalist state from capitalist investors. And that's Argentina. Remember that a few years ago, where the whole financial structure was simply pilfered and plundered. I mean, they were middle-class Argentinians. I know a woman, she had $15,000. In Argentina, that's a nest egg for her. Gone. Just all gone, wiped out. The failure of the capitalist state to protect investment capitalism from investment plunder. I sometimes think that the crucial difference between Democrats, the Democratic Party leadership, and the Republican Party leadership is that the Democrats understand this second function, and they see it as important, whereas the Republicans, especially the group that are in the White House right now, don't want to know about it. They don't care. I mean, they're going for broke. They want to take it all and grab it all. But, you know, it's very hard for us to place our faith in the Democratic Party leadership. The Democratic Party, rank and file, really did come through in enormous numbers in this past election. Many of them radicalized them. I have Democratic centrist friends of mine. Some of my best friends are Democratic centrists. And there may be some, I suspect, in this very room right here. Oh, you know who you are. But I mean, saying things like I would only hear from myself. A friend of mine, you might know his name, but I won't say it, is saying something like, "This isn't a republic anymore. This isn't a democracy. This is a banana republic. We've got a bunch of plutocrats at the top, and they're just plundering and swindling everything, and they're taking the whole, not just this country, they're building a whole empire, and they think they're going to get everything they want, blah, blah, blah." And it's really good to hear. But the Democratic leadership is pathetic in that their rank and file is way ahead of the leadership. Just as with the Republicans, it's the opposite. The leadership really knows what it's doing, and that rank and file really thinks it's all about abortion and fighting gay marriage and all those other things, and waving flags. But the Democratic leadership, in fact, when I get asked a lot, what do you think of the Democratic Party? And I always say, I think of Oscar Wilde. Because when Oscar Wilde, over a century ago, came to America, he landed in New York, and they told him, "Oh, Mr. Wilde, you must go up to Niagara Falls. That's where all the newlyweds go. It's one of the great wonders of the world, of nature. You've got to go see Niagara Falls." So Oscar Wilde went up there. He saw this great wonder of nature, the falls down there, and he said, "Niagara Falls is the second greatest disappointment that American brides experience on their honeymoon." And that's the way I feel about the Democratic Party. It's the second greatest. I told this to Dennis Kucinich when we were doing a fundraiser for him once. I said it's the second greatest disappointment, and I feel we're getting screwed, and not very well, really. You also, of course, need the state to protect capital interests abroad. Capital constantly needs to expand. It needs new markets. It has to look to distant lands. Now it's looking for ownership of the world's water supplies, ownership of the world's seed supplies, ownership of the world's ecology and such. I was thinking of the business zones in the Philippines. Capitalism. These corporations go into this area, declare it a business zone, and they go into these lovely island communities that have orchards and raise fruit and cultivate land and fish and are of modest prosperity in the sense of that they live a very nice life. So there isn't great wealth. They don't have refrigerators. They don't have television sets and all that, but they live rather nicely, and they just get driven off the land because they have no proof of ownership. These companies come in, having bribed the officials in Manila, and they take it over, and they fast buck profit. They strip all the all the trees down and sell them off. The land's turned into a wasteland, a moonscape. The people are driven off into the shanty towns where they can learn the delights of child prostitution and unemployment and the like. And so you see, for a few people to get rich, you see them creating this kind of utter misery and desolation, destroying not only a particular area, but destroying people's future, their lives, and the environment itself. So, in addition to plunder and profit, the goal is also control and power. Not power as an end in itself, not power for power's sake. You hear that all the time. You hear people say, isn't politics and history all about power, people just wanting power? No, it isn't. Power is rarely an end in itself. It is almost always used in the service of wealth or in an attempt to check wealth and oppose it. And that state power is used to protect direct investments, but it's also used to protect the whole system, the global system of investment. Sometimes at cost to direct investment. So you have the U.S. State Department, literally, State Department, holding back businesses, U.S. businesses, from making a profit in Cuba because the goal is to a more systemic one, which is to eliminate Cuba. Because Cuba is outside the free market global system. It's a bad example. It's actually offering an alternative model of how to use the land, the labor, the natural resources, and the markets of its society. And that cannot be tolerated. And that's a much more important function than having some American business go in there and make money dealing with the Cubans. So it's not really just direct investment or direct profit or direct grab of natural resources, which it could be that too, of course. Iraq is another example of overdetermination, where you're going in to get a $4 trillion trove of oil, some of the best quality crude in the world, 113 billion barrels of it. It's the biggest oil grab ever in history, and now it's in the hands not of the Iraqi government anymore, which used to sell it and use the money for its own self-development and whatever else. It's now in the hands of U.S. and to a lesser degree British oil cartels. But at the same time, you're also going in there to control that region, to tell the Iraqis that that they're a bad example, that they're self-defining, that they've been outside the free market system, and they have a publicly owned, 80% of their economy is state-owned. As Rumsfeld said, I thought it was very revealing, he said, it's a Stalinized economy, and so we've got to privatize it. There's a special committee in Iraq that is privatizing everything in the economy, just as in Yugoslavia the same process was done, to privatize everything, deregulate it, and impoverish the people and leave them hungry and own it all. Take away their public services, take away their public resources. See, the hungrier and the poorer I can make you, the harder you will work for less and less. Why do you think you as Americans don't line up for jobs that pay 15 cents an hour, but they do in Indonesia and they do in Haiti? Is it because you're so much more self-respecting than the Indonesians or Haitians? No, it's because we are at a level of historical struggle that we don't have to do that. In 1900, we did line up for jobs for that kind of money or less. In 1900, the United States was a third world country, a half a century before the term had ever been invented. We had mass underemployment. We had diphtheria and tuberculosis epidemics in our eastern cities. We had children not going to school, hardly any public education to speak of. Public services and family aid consisted of a few soup kitchens in the back of churches, and that was it. It took a century of struggle to get us to the point where we live at a somewhat better level. A century of democratic struggle reining in and containing the forces of free market plutocracy. This same free market plutocracy, by the way, isn't so free market when it comes to themselves. While they preach to you the virtues of self-reliance, stop going to the government for a handout. Rely on yourself and your own efforts. They themselves got their hands in the public treasury Right, I mean, they've got their arms right up to their elbows in the public treasury. They themselves get equity subsidies from the federal government. They get loan guarantees. They get export subsidies. They get research and development assistance. They get production loss compensations. They get bailouts, only for the giants. Mom and pop doesn't get bailed out. If you got your little business and you go under, you go under. Goodbye. But if you're Chrysler Corporation, remember when Chrysler got bailed out in the 70s? Lee Iacocca. Remember that? Lee Iacocca. What a corporate genius. Oh, they'd be on the cover of Time magazine. Lee Iacocca took Chrysler. It was at the edge of going over, and he brought it back. He didn't bring it back. I know who brought Chrysler back. I'm looking at the people who brought Chrysler back right now. The U.S. taxpayers. That's who brought it back. He got all these Pentagon contracts, and he started making tanks for the Pentagon and this for the Pentagon. Cut back, the unions had to swallow all the losses, take all the pain, and that's how he made Chrysler solvent again. And he was applauded as some kind of a genius. Public sector services are not something that the plutocrats like. Public sector services create jobs, they bring in revenues, they serve human needs, they carry out productive tasks, and yet the plutocracy doesn't make a penny in profit. They are not-for-profit services. Not-for-profit should be forbidden, as the plutocrats would see it. The plutocrats are also good at stepping all over those who can't defend themselves, the low income, the disabled. And another thing that can't defend itself is the environment. And they're really good at plundering the environment. In fact, these guys believe that whatever is left of our natural resources are theirs to have when they want, to do what they want with it, to maximize their profits on terms that they define. Okay. When this wealth goes abroad, and when you begin to take over other countries, and you begin to put these countries under a kind of receivership, and you begin to talk about regime change, and you begin to talk about the need to build institutions and teach these lesser peoples the blessings of democracy and such. I mean, in Iraq had a democratic revolution in 1958. And they nationalized their oil industry, and they were starting all sorts of wonderful democratic programs. They don't need any guidance in how to self-govern. What's left out is that the U.S. and the CIA, backing Saddam Hussein, went in there and destroyed. Saddam Hussein went in there and tortured and murdered or drove into exile or underground every Democrat, every communist, every progressive, every reformer, every constitutionalist that it lived in Iraq. And when he was doing those things in his worst years, he was Washington's poster boy. They loved him. They couldn't do enough for him. It's only when he got out of line on the oil prices, it's only when he didn't hand all that oil back over to the British and U.S. companies that the '58 revolution had kicked out. It's only when he started self-developing and training cadres of Iraqi engineers and talking about Iraq for the Iraqis, and Iraq developed the highest standard of living in the Middle East. That's when they went after him. He was a bad example. So this empire that we build, this empire feeds off the republic, as all empires do. And you can see that today. I go all around this country lecturing just in the past 5 or 6 months. I must tell you, when I pick up the local newspapers, it often looks like I'm in the same place. Every place has the same story. City council facing budget cuts. State with a heavy debt. Blah, blah, blah. Cuts. Services being cut back. This, that, and the other thing. The republic has to do with less so that the empire can feed itself. $280 billion for Iraq and for Halliburton and Bechtel and the 70 other companies that are there. Much of that money unaccountable, unsupervised, and meanwhile drastic cuts here. So the center bleeds while the periphery expands. Athens is starved so that Sparta can glisten with its swords in the sun. But there exists not only class oppression, but class struggle. The many fight back against the few. Democracy, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, democracy is a wonderful invention by the people of history to defend themselves against the abuses of wealth. That's what democracy was in ancient Athens. That's what democracy was in the Roman Republic. In my book, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, I talk about the constant struggle that went on between the tribal assemblies and popular leaders like the Gracchi and Caesar and these people as against the aristocrats in the Roman Senate. A constant struggle that went on. It was democracy against plutocracy. The many fight back against the few. George Bush summed it up in his inimitable way. He said, "It sure would be a lot easier to govern if this was a dictatorship," unquote. Oh, from the mouths of babes come utterances of truth. But democracy is more than its electoral and representational procedures. It also has a substance and a content. People just don't fight for the vote as an abstraction. They fight for the vote because they want something. When white male workers in the 1820s fought to get franchise and fought to get rid of property qualifications, they weren't doing this simply because their civics lessons in school told them it's good to vote and you'd be a better citizen. They didn't go to school. They didn't hear that kind of stuff. They fought for it because they wanted a better living wage. To get a better living wage, they needed to develop combinations, as they were called then, or what we would call unions. To get the unions, they had to change the laws that made such combinations illegal. To change those laws, they had to change the office holders. To change the office holders, they had to get at the state that was on their neck. They had to get into that political process. To get into that political process, they had to change the rules that were excluding them from that process. And that's the same struggle that African Americans went through. It's the same struggle that women went through. When women started their movements in the 19th century for the franchise, it wasn't some gender ego which said, you men have the vote, so we should have the vote. It wasn't abstracted. It was in a social context where women couldn't own property, where women were consigned to the worst, lowest, rotten-paying jobs, where they had no protections of person, where they had all sorts of struggles. You know what those struggles are, because many of them are still going on right to this day. But so the fight, the expansion of procedural democracy is also part of the fight for substantive democracy. It's not only should be government by the people, it should be government for the people. The payoffs, the end policy. What's the good of us electing people who then serve themselves rather than serve us? So that is what it's about. It is procedural democracy and substantive democracy. This is not to say that procedural democracy is just rituals and the icing on the cake and just the accoutrements. No, it's a very important part of it. The right to have the vote, the right for free speech, these are weapons that you can use to mobilize to resist the plutocracy. And capitalism doesn't work that well when democracy gathers any kind of strength. Capitalism doesn't work that well in Denmark or Western Europe or even North America. It doesn't work as well as it does in capitalist Nigeria and Indonesia, where the value added and the profit return is many times more, where the capitalist doesn't have to worry about pension funds and paid vacations and all those other things. So the goal of the capitalist is not a prosperous society, it's a prosperous class. And they'd rather have you poor if it means more for them, if it means putting you back, if it means getting rid of this damned equality. They don't want a society where the son of an Italian immigrant family can go to school and go all the way up and then write books about them. That isn't what they want. And so understand the Bush agenda. It's a very resourceful, single-minded agenda in everything from the appointment of judges to family service policies to the attack on Social Security, to the use of deficits, to bloating deficits, which is another way, upward redistribution of income. You borrow money from the people you should be taxing, and then you tax the people here in this room to pay back the rich creditors. You privatize your federal budget. The bigger your deficit goes, the larger chunk of your federal budget is privatized. I mean, the largest chunk of your tax dollar goes to these big, rich creditors. Social Security is attacked not because it doesn't work, but because it does work. Here's the only. Can you imagine a system, a policy that has produced $1.4 trillion surplus over the last 20, 30 years, and it's constantly being attacked as insufficiently funded, and it's going to go under? It's producing these surpluses all the time. And anything down the road. 30 years ago, George Bush, little George Bush, the one who's in the White House now, Jr., when he ran for Congress in Texas and lost in 1978, he was predicting that Social Security would go broke by 2005 or so. Well, I think he said 2007. I'm sorry. Okay. It's not going broke. It's producing $60 billion surpluses. The way to get it to go broke is by privatizing it and unraveling it. And when he turns around and tells older people that you pensioners, don't worry, your accounts are fine, that's a lie. Because once you start privatizing it, there goes the financing of it. And these people will not, there won't be any money for their checks, their monthly checks. And when he says, well, young people, they feel there isn't going to be any Social Security by the time they get there, so I'm working out, I'm helping them. Yeah, they feel that way because people like you have been attacking it year after year after year. So this is a very resourceful agenda. They want no alternative support systems, no unemployment, no Social Security. The more alternative support and wage support systems you have, the better position labor is in to negotiate decent wages. When you knock out those alternative support systems and income sources, then labor has to negotiate from yet a still weaker position, and wages can be deflated. So this Bush agenda is remarkably consistent. I'm going to end right here pretty much. It's engaged in the struggle to maximize the accumulation process. To achieve this, it'll ally itself with religious fundamentalists. It'll pursue lifestyle and cultural issues, abortion, gay marriage. It'll play upon people's frustrations and channel them toward irrelevant foes. It'll take people with real legitimate grievances who can't define it because these issues are never discussed. I tell you, you can live another 30, 50, 60, 70 years, you will not hear, maybe, I hope I'm wrong, but let me put it this way. I can tell you, in all the years you have lived, you have never heard the discussion I'm giving you right now in the major media. Not even in fair and balanced Fox networks. Would you believe that? So they get no explanation for what's happening. So what the plutocracy does is direct their frustrations toward irrelevant enemies. The gays, the feminists, the feminazis, the godless, the people who turn their back on God, the ethnic minorities, the worthless poor who are presumed to be the authors of their own poverty, and of course the ruthless terrorists and all that. But all the while, this Bush administration has its eyes on the prize. Do not think that George Bush is stupid. Do not think they're confused. Just because they say confusing things, just because they want to confuse you, doesn't mean that they're confused. Just because you expose the explanations they give as confused and wrong and ill-fitted, doesn't mean that they needed your assistance. You're being stupid when you think your enemies are stupid. When you think that the people who own and control the land, the labor, the capital, and the resources of most of the world are stupid, then you are falling back on very facile kind of... I mean, there are liberal intellectuals who love to rock back and forth, talk about Bush, he mispronounces words. They did this. I had the same problem with Reagan. Oh, he's so stupid. And here this guy was sticking it to us up one side, down the other, with more rational, consistent resourcefulness than I had seen any president. Jimmy Carter didn't know what he's doing. Bill Clinton, when he came in, didn't know. These guys have an ideological dedication, just the way they pack the judiciary with young right-wing lawyers appointed to federal judgeships in their 30s who are handing down decisions from 1980. This was handing down decisions right into the second and third decade of this century. We're stuck with them. And while others were standing around talking about how stupid they all are. So he mispronounces words. Big deal. We all do to some degree. The goal of the Bush administration is to improve the rate of capital accumulation, to weaken the ability of the employee class to make inroads into that accumulation process. The progressive goal is to distribute the wealth more fairly to its producers. The people who do the work should get a better slice of it. The Bush goal is to stop that, to use the state to weaken rather than to secure the democratic process, to keep the accoutrements and trimmings of democracy while increasingly divesting it of its substance, to steal elections by privatizing the voting system and vote counting, by using private companies to vet registration rolls. You know, 1 million votes were stolen even before November 4th. Greg Palast made that point. They brought any number of states, the Secretary of State, if it's a Republican, brought in people to vet these rolls, and doing it in heavily Democratic areas and saying, oh, this name, Jay Taylor, I think it's this James Taylor, it's Ohio, this was James Taylor arrested in Illinois, so take him off, he's an ex-con and the like. Overwhelmingly Democratic voters in each case. All the discrepancies in voting and tallies and such, all the discrepancies with the exit polls, which are always very accurate, all of them were seemed to go only in one direction, to favor Bush. The odds of random error, the odds of that happening through random error are 1,000,000 to 1. And above all, to achieve a wealth distribution that is markedly, steeply unequal. Increase that portion of the gross national income that is unearned income from investments, and decrease that portion that is earned through wages, salaries, fees, and pensions. So Max Weber, a German sociologist of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, put it this way: a bourgeois social theorist, not a Marxist at all. I wouldn't quite call him an anti-Marxist. He never once mentioned Marx in all his writings, never went near it. But he did say this: the question is, said Max Weber, how are freedom and democracy in the long run at all possible under the domination of a highly developed capitalism? That question is still with us. There's a lot at stake. One of the things that are at stake, as you know, is democracy itself, the environment itself, the society, all of that. Don't think for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, don't think that our reactionary rulers, they're not conservatives. A conservative is someone who wants to resist change to maintain his privileges. But these guys are reactionaries. They want to undo things and do make, indeed, many changes to go back to a yet more retrograde society. Don't think that these reactionary rulers don't care about what we think. Oh, man, do they care. That is their single most important political concern. Everything they do, every press conference that Scott does, every phony journalist he plants in the room to ask a phony question, every kind of story feed they hand out to the medias, everything they do is to keep us convinced of their lies. It's to wave the flag in our faces, to manipulate and pretend, to keep the boys and girls fighting and dying. They are very concerned about what we think. They're sometimes more concerned than we seem to be, but all because they know that all governments, all regimes, all rulers, to some extent, varying extent, to one extent or another, all of them ultimately rest on public opinion. And when that opinion shifts and when that support declines, then they have to backpedal, hide their arrogance, pretend to share our outrage and our concerns, and to keep the pretense credible, they have to take actions and make concessions that they don't want to make at all and which they can hardly wait to undo. So our job, our answer is democracy, democracy, and more democracy, to educate, organize, agitate, and create horizontally a greater climate of opinion that is at variance with theirs and would challenge theirs, and then also vertically to impact it upon our representatives. When the people are ready to lead, the leaders will eventually follow. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Author and political analyst Michael Parenti, speaking on April 8th at Hampshire College.